Hello, my name is Beck Tench, and this is my dissertation proposal. I'm creating a video for those who couldn't attend the defense just so that you can have an idea of what I'm up to. So thank you for your time and for listening. So my dissertation proposal is entitled The Restorative Potential of Participatory Design in the Attention Economy. And before I get to what the research questions I'm going to answer are all about, I want to talk a little bit about what sparked this dissertation and the sort of history leading up to coming to these questions. So really, when I think about when this proposal started, I have to go all the way back to 2008 when I began to work at a science museum in North Carolina. At that museum, I was using technology to create exhibits and experiences that try to get people to slow down and notice the world around them. And I went and looked. I had over 80 experiments that I conducted in my time there at the museum. And some of them were, a success, and some of them were not so much a success. But truly, when I look at all of those experiments, the only person I can really say for sure that was slowing down was me. And so I came to a point, and I ended up leaving the museum, when I realized that we were spending a lot of money and a lot of time trying to use technology to get people to slow down, and it wasn't compatible with what technology was doing for people. And so, we would do exhibits or what have you that were really infused with tech that performed poorly compared to just basically having a table with some blocks on them and the kind of learning that would happen in that environment. And so I kind of went on a bit of a path of soul searching and serendipity and ended up out here in 2016 looking at starting a PhD program and really wanting to go deep into these questions of slowing down and technology. And I have come to some conclusions about what the problem is and how to do that, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But something happened last summer that was particularly pivotal for this dissertation that I'm proposing. So I was granted some funds to create a map of restorative spaces on campus. And I thought I'd also been given the chance to teach a design class. And so I thought, what if I used participatory design and had undergraduates create the map that they would use to find restorative spots on campus? And so I taught two versions of Info 360, which is a design methods course for undergraduates, where the purpose of the class was to create a map of restorative space or to create restorative spaces. It ended up changing a bit because I was using participatory design, and the way the students wanted to go is where we went. And the funny thing was, I was very thoughtful in how I put this class together and everything, but the point was always to create and to learn design. It wasn't to change ourselves. But I started to notice that students were indicating that they were slowing down. And I began to wonder, were students slowing down for the same reason I was? And that was because we were designing for others to slow down. And so that is really what brings me here today and what drives the inquiry behind this dissertation. First, I want to know what happened in that class. Were students actually slowing down? And if so, what kinds of activities or experiences caused them to? Second, what was the role of design in all of that? Did it play a role in actually slowing people down or restoring them? And then third, can I take what I learned from this undergraduate experience and put it into a different realm altogether? So that's what my project is about. But before we dive into the details of it, I want to talk about what the problem is that where I've arrived at what the problem is with regards to using technology to slow down and why that's so difficult. So, there's a well-established body of literature that helps us understand that the tech industry today, and for the last 20 years really, has been one in which they have harvested, commoditized, and traded human attention. So this is called the attention economy. Others have other words for it. But really, what is at play in the dynamics between our use of our technology and our attention is that the longer we spend on screen, the more data that companies can use to predict our behavior, and then they sell those predictions to other companies who want certainty over our behavior, so they can send us a message at the right time and we will buy the thing or believe the thing or what have you. And so there's this entire economy at play. There are a lot of scholars that I lean on to understand what exactly is happening, and I kind of want to gesture at these scholars and invite you to email me to have further conversations about how these people in particular inform my work, but I want to just call them out now. So Shoshana Zuboff at Harvard Business School, and her work in surveillance capitalism really helps me understand the mechanisms of the marketplace under which this digital exhaust, these like nonsense data that we throw out about how we format our text or misspell it, actually predicts our behavior. Shannon Valor and her ethical framework for how to behave, use, and design technology is also highly influential in my understanding of this problem. And then B.J. Fogg's work in behavior design. B.J. Fogg's a sort of a psychologist and technologist who has helped people understand how to manipulate behavior and make technology persuasive. And so I have to look at his work to better understand the nature of how these companies are able to capture so much of our attention. And then James Williams, who is a philosopher and scholar who centers on ethics and has written a book called Stand Out of Our Light, which is really a way for us to both individually and collectively resist the attention economy. So these people highly inform my understanding of the problem. But a couple years ago, I took a class with Susan Hildreth, and one of the things I really took away from that class is we don't always need to just look at the problem. Sometimes we also need to look at what we're doing from a point of view of opportunities. And so I also want to just show you a bit about the opportunities I see that I can build upon in this work. So there are a lot. I could spend actually a lot of time telling you about the wonderful work of so many people who are already doing work that I am building upon. But I want to call out three realms or disciplines of research specifically. So the first is out of environmental psychology, and it's called attention restoration theory. And the second is information and contemplation, or contemplative studies, some people call it. And the third is participatory design. So I want to dive into my framing, or my understanding at least, of each one of these and how it is informing my project. So attention restoration theory, as I said, comes out of environmental psychology, and it is about 40 years old, and it actually builds upon William James's work back in the 1800s, when he theorized that attention had two states, a voluntary state and an involuntary state. And so according to ART, attention restoration theory, you're using your voluntary attention to listen to this video. If upon listening to it, at the end of it, you'll actually have a little bit less attention to pay to other things. And if at a certain point you do that all day without ever restoring your attention, you will become irritable, stressed out, less sensitive to others, more error prone, and in a state of directed attention fatigue. That is, that all the voluntary attention you had is gone, and you are basically in a place of pain with regards to paying attention to the world. And what the Kaplans also theorized and then demonstrated through many empirical experiments is that if you take a fatigued attention and you put it in a restorative environment, and I'll explain what that means in a minute, you essentially invoke the involuntary attention. So these restorative environments are kind of tailor-made to get us to pay attention without having to use our voluntary attention, the kind of attention you're using with me right now. When we use our involuntary attention, and that would be in a situation, let's say, that wherever you're sitting right now, if there's a window, imagine that a bird just sort of flitted and then just stood right there at the sill of that window with a worm in its mouth. And you noticed that, and you just sort of looked at it and kind of like watched that bird and what it was doing. That would be invoking your involuntary attention. It'd be very difficult actually to not pay attention to that bird. But what the bird is doing is not particularly demanding, and it's not like arresting like maybe a train wreck or a Twitter feed would be. So you are kind of just lightly, softly fascinated by this bird. And when you're in a situation where your involuntary attention is being used, your voluntary attention rests. So that's the theory. That's what they've demonstrated through empirical research. So in addition to that soft fascination piece, and a restorative environment also has to meet 3 other criteria. It has to be away from the demanding environment in some capacity. It needs to be compatible with what you're trying to do. So for example, it may feel restorative to sort of lie in the pond of water floating on your back. But if you were doing that in Drumheller Fountain on UW's campus, it wouldn't be restorative because you're not supposed to be there. So it has to be compatible. And it has to have extent. And that simply means that there needs to be enough to interest you, but not so much that you're overwhelmed. So when you have an environment with soft fascination and those 3 other things, you have an environment where your involuntary attention can take over and your voluntary attention can fill up. So that's the first thing that I want you to know about. The second is about this idea of contemplation and what that even means. So there's a huge number of disciplines and researchers who are investigating contemplation, who have for years and years and years. You've got neuroscientists who are doing fMRIs of monks who meditate, and you have teachers who are using contemplative practices in their classroom, and you have clergy people who are contemplatives by trade. So there's all sorts of ways to understand and investigate contemplation. But for my purposes, what I mean when I say contemplative is that I'm present right now. I'm not caught up in the future, and I'm not caught up in the past. I'm just right here, right now. And furthermore, when I'm here right now, I notice that in any moment, there's actually 2 things going on. There is the moment, the stimulus of the moment, and then there's my reaction to that. So there's a stimulus and a response in every present moment that I am available to. But in that, normally, as we live our life, stimulus and response, they're just smack dab right next to each other. And with contemplative practice, one of the byproducts of it is that we put space between those things. So in that space, we can put intention. And a lot of contemplative practices have you put intentions like compassion in that space. But for the purposes of this work, one of the things that will be required if we actually are present to, let's just say, a moment of distraction with our devices, that we can then have an intention to choose differently if we want to. And so that space is very important for changing the kinds of behaviors that are so automated and manipulative, the psychological vulnerabilities that these ICTs tap into through design. So the third thing I want to talk about for you to really understand where I'm coming from is participatory design. So participatory design has a long history of designers that are opening up their design process so that people have a greater say in the way that technology affects their lives. But it has kind of branched off and done a bunch of different things. And so I want to be specific about how I intend to use PD, which is what I use to call participatory design. So for me, I am very influenced by Bodker and King's new PD vision, and that PD for me is about empowerment and democratic participation in technology. It isn't so much about user feedback and user friendliness and all that stuff, which it also has a rich history of. So I see PD as institutions. As a researcher, I am inheriting some power from my credentials and my institution. And then I'm in sort of a designerly Aikido move, pushing that power right back to the people that the institution exists to serve. And so that is how I see PD. That is how I'm using PD. It is about sharing power and using however I can have power, using that to give to others. So with all of that said, let's jump into the research questions and talk about how I'm going to try to come to some conclusions. So the first question I have, this is the question I referred to earlier as what happened in Info 360, is how can individuals protect and restore their attention when many of their interactions are mediated by technologies incentivized to exploit it? So specifically, I'm looking at my students. I'm not looking at all of us because I'm not able to say something about all of us. But I think understanding these students that seem to slow down, how were they doing so? How are they protecting and restoring their attention? And were their behaviors and attitudes changing towards their technologies? So I'm going to study that, and then based on, let's just hope and say, I don't need to say hope, but let's just say that there are some students that truly did slow down, and that's just not some assumption, but the research bears that out. Then I want to dig in with just some of the students that were truly slowing down and understand if design played a role in that. So how can design process itself be restorative? So I will understand that too. So after understanding 1 and 2, I want to then go and say, how can I transfer this elsewhere? And I want to look at libraries specifically, because libraries are places that have long valued human dignity and democracy, and both of those things I believe are threatened by the attention economy. So I want to look at how can we engage and inspire library workers to see the restorative potential of libraries in the attention economy. So let me talk about how I'm going to do these things. This slide charts out the whole dissertation in one view, and I want to point out a couple things first. First, this column here, which is my data collection method. So I just want to note that I'm using a range of data collection. I'm going to be using PD and having artifacts from PD workshops in the PD classes. I'm using a qualitative questionnaire, and I'm also using interviews and focus groups. I almost said Facebook groups. Not using Facebook groups for this, focus groups. In addition to that, I'm going to use thematic analysis and interpretive phenomenological analysis to analyze these data, but I will explain all of that. So let's dive into question 1. So for question 1, this is about what happened in Info 360 and how we protect and restore our attention when we have to use tech that exploits it. I have 2 phases for my data collection. The first phase is complete, and it is that I have run these 2 classes. And a special shout out and thank you to my TA Saba, who just was incessant about me getting an I or B for this class, because I didn't know at the time that I would be studying it, and I am. So thank you, Saba. So I have 86 students who have consented to participate in this study and all of their classwork, and it is truly thousands of data items to examine. So I have photos, sketches, design artifacts, and written reflections, visions, all sorts of things that these students very thoughtfully put into the class. And I also began and ended both classes with an initial reflection and a final reflection. And those questions that I asked were tied together, and they were about students' relationship to technology, attitudes about technology, and stress. And so I would like to follow up, excuse me, in my second phase of data collection with a qualitative questionnaire that gets them to reflect on that again, so that I have 3 points in time in which to look at their attitudes and behaviors towards technology. So if you imagine, after that qualitative questionnaire is complete, I will have all this data, and I'm going to use Braun and Clark's 6-phase method of thematic analysis, which basically has you this huge data corpus. You go through it very methodically to arrive at a data set, and then you go through a series of steps very methodically to understand the themes that belong to that data set. And so I will be doing that, and at the end of that, I will have, I hope, some strategies that students have used for protecting and restoring their attention, and associating those strategies with specific assignments or experiences in our class. I will also have a list of students that I believe showed evidence of slowing down, and I'm going to take that list into Q2, my second question. Design is restorative. So this is the question where I understand what role design played, and I want to look at the students, the like when it worked really well set of students, and I want to use phenomenological research to understand what their experience was. And specifically, I want to use Jonathan Smith's interpretive phenomenological analysis to look at the experience they had of the design process and the meaning they made from it. And IPA is particularly good for understanding experience and meaning, which is why I'm using it. So I will interview at least 4 students. I might interview more, but I'll interview at least 4. It will be a fairly homogeneous sample, because I want to get students that are as alike as possible, so that whatever conclusions I draw from their experience and meaning is specific and particular to a certain kind of phenomena. At the end of the IPA process, I will have, presumably, some evidence of the design process as restorative or not. And I will also have the descriptions and experiences that students share from the class and the meaning that they made from it. So I'll have a set of that. At the end of Q1 and Q2, I will hopefully know a lot more about what happened in Info 360, and I'll also have some ideas about what role design might play in restoring us. I'm going to take those understandings into Q3, which is how do I get this into other realms besides the undergraduate classroom. So I'm going to look specifically, as I said, at libraries. And the reason why is because I have worked for libraries, not for libraries, I've worked with libraries for about 10 years and have a very robust national network of librarians that I can use in workshops and focus groups and interviews to better understand how this will truly fly in the library field. I also want to use libraries because I believe that this work can untap some of the restorative potential that they have in their bones and in their institutions and buildings. And so I think that they're a great place to start this work. So the first thing I'd like to do with the librarians is I want to conduct some interviews. I've already started talking a little bit with some folks I know, and I've realized a couple of things about this transfer that are going to be difficult. The first is that not all librarians are on the same page about the attention economy and whether or not it is a harmful thing. So some people are right there and others are kind of resistant. And so I need to understand what that's about and how to best frame this work. Secondly, no librarian is going to be able to give me 10 weeks at 5 hours a week plus any sort of out of class work. So the curriculum that I'm working for in a formal education environment is not going to work in professional development context or a community engagement context. So I need to understand what's feasible in terms of format for librarians. So to do that, I'm going to interview 6 library leaders. These are people that I feel will be exceptionally candid with me, but also have a real sense of where the library field is in regard to this. And then at the end of those interviews, I am going to ask those library leaders to recommend a handful of people that they believe would be really all about this kind of thing, and a handful of people they think would be quite reluctant to explore it. And I'm going to have a big long list of practitioners, both likely and unlikely to adopt something like this, that I want to hold some focus groups with. So I want to hold 4 focus groups with at least 16 librarians. And in those focus groups, I want to workshop the key ideas and experiences that I learn in the what happened in Info 360 research question to better understand what their reactions and appetites are for that kind of work and if they have the space for it. So then at the end of the focus groups, I will have a PD workshop. I want to actually invite a group of librarians and other kinds of practitioners together in a workshop format that I have used for about 7 years. And it is based on some work out of the sustainable fishing industry, and I have used it many times since, including here at the iSchool a couple of years ago with Susan Hildreth and her DPIR work. But it's a wonderful workshop format. Happy to say more about it if you have questions. But in interest of time, I would just say that I want to use this workshop because it is very reliable at getting totally novel, wild, original ideas documented and created in a group of practitioners. And so at the end of the PD workshop, I will have 4 or 5 ideas for a curriculum that are not anchored at all in the Info 360 world or idea of this. But then I'll also have interviews and focus groups that are anchored in that world. And then combined, I want to do a thematic analysis as I did the Braun and Clark's method in Q1. I want to repeat that thematic analysis for Q3 using the interview transcripts, focus group transcripts, and ideas from the workshop, and design a new curriculum that is for library workers. I will then send that curriculum back to everyone in Q3 that I have interacted with, so to get their feedback and member check that curriculum with them. I'll revise it based on that feedback, and then I will have a curriculum that I'll be able to take into the library field after my PhD to then work with libraries like I did with my undergraduates to design and co-create restorative environments with and for their communities. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I welcome your questions. Just send me a message at tench@uw.edu if you have any questions or ideas or you want to participate. And if you want to dive into some of the citations that I mentioned, just go to becktench.com/dissertation, and there's a big long list that you can dive right into. So thank you again for your time.